Okay, so today, right, we're going to discuss about the next thing in Playwright, which is the controlling power, right, within Playwright, which is the configuration file, the config file of Playwright. Just a minute. Okay, so our today's session would be about this file, config file, and exact name of the file is playwright.conf.ts. Okay, so this is like an input file for your Playwright to function. Okay, so everything is controlled through this file or the parameters set in this file. Let's go to Playwright website. So this is the website, docs and APIs. Okay, let me also create a branch for today. We are on day 4, or today is day 5, right? What is complaining? Yes. How many files I changed? I changed only this file. And the changes, it's all this. Fine, let's just discard the changes. Git checkout minus speed, day 5. Correct. Now, yeah, so we're talking about this file, close others. All right. Okay, so we are going to talk about this file, playwright config.ts, right? This is a file, this is like an input file through which everything is controlled in Playwright, okay? As a testing, as a test runner, or as a framework. So to understand this, right, uh, okay, to understand this, right, there are a lot of sections within it which we should be knowing properly, and there are certain terminology which Playwright has defined. So if we use those terminology, it would become very easy for us to understand this documentation. Otherwise, it can create a lot of confusion. So I'll try to try to segregate that confusion, right, and let us make us aware, like what means what, right? Okay, so let's start. So there is this file, playwright.conf.ts, and over here, right, you will have to you see this file over here. This got generated automatically when you created the project, right, through that init process. So there is a what we say, there is a function, right, coming from this library, playwright test, and this function is what you use, right, over here to define your properties. Okay, but you will have to import this. So let's just make this thing very clear. So what we're doing is you will have to import define config from playwright @playwright test. Okay, once you do this, right, you will have to say export const define config, and you would be defining your parameters of the configuration over here. Okay, now this is your entire configuration file. Okay, this is your entire configuration file, and it has certain sections within it. So the first section, right, I would say, or let me just generalize it, how it looks like. It over here, right, it is like there are certain general properties which you can set. Let me write general properties. After this, right, you can have a use section. Okay, this is an object, and here again you can provide some properties. After this, you also have a project section, projects, right, which we have been seeing. This is an array of projects, right? So this is an array of projects, and we'll talk about further. So there is one section, this general section, general purpose. Second is the use section. Third is the project section, and there's a fourth one, which is the expect section, which has the properties related to the assertions which we can add in the playwright. Okay, in a nutshell, these are the four sections which you have in this configuration file: a general properties, a use section, a project section, and a expect section. Okay, now what are these? What properties fall under which section, and what is the purpose of them? That is the most crucial part here to understand. Okay, now if you see this, right, the properties which you define here, right? Okay, before going there, let me tell you, there are three scoping levels. Okay, there are three scoping levels in Playwright. One, you call it as a global scope. When you say global scope, it means that it is applicable for everything in Playwright. Whatever you do, wherever you are, it is applicable everywhere. Okay. After this, right, there is another level within it which is called as the project level. You have the entire thing of the Playwright, and within the Playwright, you said, okay, I want to run some test cases for this browser, maybe these test cases for the another browser, or maybe the same test cases on the other browser, right? And for that, you create projects. Right? Now, every project can have multiple test cases and files, right? So the last level here, which you can have, is the test level. So there are three levels: global, project level, and the test level. Okay. Now, when we talk about general properties here, right? The general properties, whatever you define here, right, are applicable for the global scope. Okay. When you define something in a use section, okay, these are also available. This also means for global section, right? This also means for global section, but there is a certain purpose of this use section. Okay, it is meant to provide properties related to three things, I believe, right? Let us take the documentation help. Okay, test use option, right? In addition to configuring test runner, you can also configure emulations, network, and recording for the browser and the browser context. Let us write this. Emulation. Again, this is nothing which we'll be dealing with, okay? But since it says, so I'm providing this recording section, right? And of the browser and the browser context. You know what is browser and browser context now, right? So using this use sections, you can provide the properties of the browser context for all these kind of parameters, right? Emulation, networking, recording, and there are other parameters also, right? Now, this is one thing, right? But again, these two are still for the global scope. For the global scope. Okay, so it means that if you do not define the project section, okay, if you do not define the project section, and you just define these two, right, any test case you try to run, right, will be working based on the properties defined in these two sections. Okay, now let's say you decided, okay, I want to divide, right, or have multiple projects within it. So the one project is here, right, which is, let's say, for Chrome. Other project could be like something for Firefox, right? Let's say, right. Now within this, right, first of all, this here, right, when you introduce projects, you are introducing a project scoping. Okay, you are introducing a project scoping, the project scoping, right? Now, what is the project's information? For that, you can go here in the project section. A project is a logical group of tests running with the same configuration. Okay, running with the same configuration. So let's say you have the intention that, okay, I wanted to run things on Chrome, I wanted to run things on Firefox. So I wanted to have certain types of configuration only for Chrome. I wanted to have a certain set of configuration only for Firefox, right? So that is your like input area, right, where you can define all that, which is your project section. Where it went here, right? In the project section. So you will create a project for Chrome and you will define some properties there. What properties? We're going to discuss it. Similarly for Firefox, right? You can define here and you can keep on creating multiple projects like this. Okay. Now, where it went projects. So yeah, on different browser and devices, projects are configured in this, and once configured, you can then run your projects on a specific project, right? Okay. Does it tell you everything here or no? If you see this, right, the project section, it shows you that you can define all this, and there is so much more into it, right, which you can define, which I'm going to tell you, okay, during our session today. But you can see, right, this is how you define projects, which we have already seen. So it's not that you wanted to only define for the browser level. No, you can have the projects. If you see, right, see, the project is more like, if you see, right, is a logical group of tests running with the same configuration. Okay, that is what it is used for. Okay, it is not that it is only meant for browsers. So what I mean by this is, what you can also do is, let's say you have 100 test cases. Okay, let's say you have 100 test cases, and you wanted to create a subset of regression test cases and smoke test cases. So what you should do? You should create two projects. You should create two projects. One project would be what? One project would be for regression, and here, right, you can define what all test cases you wanted to cover. The second project could be for your smoke test, right? And it can work on it. Now, which browser to use, which all information to use, that information, right, would be taken up from these global properties. Once we go into it, we'll understand more, right? But try to understand what is the purpose of project. Project is like a configuration, right, which you are providing as a separate thing, which will contain some test cases within it, on which it will be applied. Okay. Now that the properties which you're applying, right, could be anything. In most of the cases till now, we have been providing a property called browser name, right, or the browser, different browsers. So that is also a property. We are changing that property here in the P1 project and the P2. In P1 we said Chrome, and P2 we said Firefox. If you want, you can just ignore it and define these browser over here. That okay, my general browser name is Chromium, right, and the channel name for it would be Chrome. If you define it here, right, both the projects, and you do not define anything here, right, these two properties will be taken by both the projects, right, and you can trigger it, and you can control which project to run. When you run npx playwright test, you can also define the project which you really wanted to work. If you have 10 different projects defined, you can define that okay, run the regression one, run the smoke one, and whatever properties it might have, it will take it up and run it accordingly. Okay. Okay, so this is the project section. Now one more thing to add in the project, right? Okay, let me first show you the properties of projects. Where can you find it? You will find it in the API library, and not here. You will find it under test project. Okay, if you click on it, you see all these properties here. All these properties you can define in the project section. Okay, all these properties can be defined in the project section. What can you define in the configuration? See, yeah, why it comes up like this? Yeah, here. Now see this, right? If you wanted to know which all properties can you define here in the project section, you should look for this test project. Okay, these are the properties, these are the methods, properties, right, which you can use. So you can use all of this. If you wanted to know what all properties you can set under this section, right, under this section. So here, for this, just for this, right, there are two different sections which you will have to refer. If you say about the general purpose part, right, general purpose part, where is it? It is in the test config. So if you see this, right, test config, it has these properties which you can set, all these properties, right? Now within the test, within this section, right, there is a use section, right? So there could be some properties for the use. So what all properties can you use for the use section? For that, you will have to use test. I think it is section. What is the name of it? Yes, it is this test options. Okay, so all the properties which you see here, right, in test options are meant for your use section. Okay, so let me now write it down just to make things clear, right? So if you wanted to know about this property, right, the properties, all the properties which you can set here, you should look for test config section on the API under the test runner, test options. If you wanted to know about the use thing, right, what all can you provide in the use section? So for the use section, you should look for test options. Let me write test options. And if you wanted to know what all properties can you set per project, right, in these projects, you should look for what? You should look for test project. Are we clear about these three library names? Test config, test options, test project. And these are this is again a very important information, right? Because you will when you start working on Playwright, you might want to configure a lot of things. You should not get confused from where I should grab the information. Okay, that is the most confusing part about the documentation here, because these are not straightforward. Based on my experience, based on the inference which I'm able to make, right, from all the judgments, I'm able to understand this. Okay, that this is what they are. Okay, test config, test options, test project. Okay, one additional thing, if you see this, right, Okay, so this is general section, this is use section, this is project section, and one more thing, right? Under the project section, right? See, just try to understand, right? You are doing what? These are like generalized thing, right? These two are like generalized thing. If you do not provide them, you can take these two inputs, right? You can just use it. You will use it, and those would be applied on all the test cases. What are projects, right? Project is a way for you to override or give some new configuration values for some specific test cases, right? Which you consider as a project, right? So let's say over here, right? You have set the value of browser name as Chrome, right? You want to override it. Where will you do it? You will have to create a project. You will define some projects, and here, right? You will have access to almost all the parameters which you could define here in the general section, right? And you can set them here. So what are you doing? What is happening here is there is something called global. If let's say this is the only thing available, then this becomes available, this becomes accessible to everything here, right? At the project level, at the test level. But if you have overridden that value which was written in global in the project section, right, then it becomes applicable here and it becomes applicable here, right? So the one which you mentioned above, right, is not applicable for these two, right? Only the ones which you override it. If there is something, right, which you mentioned here and those are missing here, so that is the information which would be passed on to this. So it just flows down. Okay. So these are the two things, right? Also, so try to understand, right? A project in a way, right? I can say it in other terms also. You can understand this, that a project is like the configuration file. These are like separate configuration file, right? Per project created. So it's like you will have this general properties you can mention here like this, right? Plus you can also mention the use section. So this part also you can mention here. So I will now rephrase everything, right? You can understand this is like what you define in the define config, right? The global file, the playwright config.ts file. What you define here, right, is available for everything, right? If you want to narrow down the scope, right, what you can do is you can create projects, and within the projects, right, understand that every project is like a separate config file, okay, defined, meant only for that project, right? Okay. So, and since in the normal config file you could define general properties and use section, so the same thing can be done in this project also. You can define these properties here and you can define the use part over here. Okay, but this scoping needs to be understood, right? Now the last part around the scoping part, if you see this, right, in the end what it narrows down to, it narrows down to the test cases which are running. Okay, it narrows down to the test cases which are running. So what you can do is, so let's say here, right, you are defining, okay, that you wanted to run this test case on a test case, let's say test one, right, test one dot spec dot ts, let's say. Okay, you can define it over here. So if you say this here, right, now there is a test case with this name, right, a test file with this name, test one dot spec dot ts. We have already talked about global level and the project level. Now we are going to talk about the test level, right? The test level. Now, so all these settings which you applied to global or project, right? It has to be applied on this test only, right? On this test only. So let's say you define here test and you wanted to run things over here. Okay. So what can happen here is, based on the properties which have been flowing down from the global and the project, right, would be applied on this test case. But there is one more way, right, in Playwright, that if you wanted to override, right, let's say a particular property or something, right, only specific for the test case, you are allowed to do so. How will you do it? You will have to use certain things here, right? You can set those parameters here, right? So there are multiple methods available. One is called test.use. Now when you say use here, right, it is referring using this, right, you are able to access all the properties defined in the use section, in this use section of the project which is running this test case. And so both are coming to you, right, the final version of it. Plus if you want to set some values, you can set it through the use part, which are meant for the using. Okay, one thing is that, second of all, if you wanted to access the properties, right, which are meant for the project level, the general properties here, right, or let's say the entire project thing, right, so what you can do is you can access it through test project object. Okay, so that is also available. if you wanted to access things which is at the what we say to at the this the global configuration, right, which is this one, right, you can access it through test config object, and you can set some parameters here, right, for this, for specific for this test case. So I will try to draw it again, right, and explain you again, but just try to understand. There are three scopes: global scope, project scope, test level scope, right? This is the first information which you need to have. If you wanted to define the configuration which is applicable for all the test cases and everything in Playwright, what you will do is you will create a file called playwright.com.ts, right? Create, import this thing over here, right? And then create this export constant define conf. You will have to define the define config here. And here, right, the first section, the general purpose and the use section, right? Here you can define the properties, and these are meant for the global thing, right? That is for everyone. If you want to narrow down it to a specific project, you will do what? You will create a project section and then create project objects here, right? And you can define both these two things, right, over here again, and override the values which are coming from the global scope, correct? And the last part, so what can happen here is, let's say you are not okay with the global thing, you are not okay with the project part, you wanted to run something specific for a test case. So that, so Playwright is also providing an option at the test level also. What you can do is go to your test file in the test section, right? You can access the properties, right, which are being set at the project level, which is here, right, which is being applied on this test case through test project, okay, as an object. So you will be able to access everything after this. If you wanted to access the properties which is set at the global level, right, which is this, you can get access to it through this test config part dot, and you will get the methods of it, right? And if you wanted to access the use section, right, this use part, which is like the final version of this use, and this use being applied and given to you, you can use this part over here, and you can change the properties if you wanted to of something on it. Okay, so again, there are three levels: global, project, and test. Is it clear till now? What are the levels and how you can define configuration and what levels?
Yes.
Yeah, Anand, please.
Okay, a quick question, like can there be same properties defined in both the levels, like overriding is
Uh-huh.
also possible?
Yeah, that is the purpose of having those, right?
Okay.
You can define properties here, and then you can override those values in the project part if
Okay.
you wish, like.
Hmm.
So see, I'm sure, right, we all know this, right? If there is, let's say there are three properties defined. let's say uh, let's say that the browser name, right, is set here also, it is set here also, it is set here also, right? Let's say over here I've set the browser to be used Chromium. Here I am rechanging this to Firefox, and here I am changing it to WebKit, and I'm running the test case, right? Let's say the chance came the test case will be executing. Now, when the test case looks at the configuration, right? Okay, let me check on what I should run. So it will find that, okay, that properties are coming at all three levels: test level, project level, and the global level. So tell me from your experience, which level will have the priority over here? Which one will be taken up?
I think the latest in the hierarchy will be having the priority.
Which is the latest one here?
Uh, uh, the test level.
Right, the local
Yeah.
level, right?
The local level, yeah. So
Local level, right? So that was the one which will be taken preference, and that is something on which things will be done. So that is the whole point about it, right? You are given the power to configure things at multiple levels, right, and control things accordingly. Correct. And yes, and that is what the overriding means, right? That is why you are given that power. Okay.
okay,
So that you can control things as per your wish.
understood.
Okay, great, right? So let me just draw a very let me try to draw it again just to make things like. So what we have is, we have the playwright conf.ts file, and within this file, what we have is, you will import the define config, and then you will define config here. And here, what we have is, we have a general section, okay. We will have a use section, we will have a project section. Within the project, again, it's an array of things, and this is like a single project. You can have the name of the project, and then what you can do is you can define your general purpose section again here, right? And you can define your use section here, specific for this test case. So if you have a value written here, it will be overridden in these from these values, okay. And you can have these projects like this. Let me close this, and then you also have an expect section, which we'll talk about later, but that is also a part of it. So you define the properties related to assertions in this part. Okay, so this is one thing. So in the same file, you define for the global thing and you define it for the project level. If you want to define things at test level, that will only be done in a specific test case. So for that, you will create a test, whatever text you have, right? You will go inside that file, test part, and here you can define things. If you wanted to access the parameters set at the global level, you will access them through TestConfig object. If you wanted to access things, right, which are placed at the project level, you can access them through TestProject, right? And if you wanted to access only the use part, right, the final version of the use part, you have to use TestOptions. Okay, and this will give you the final version combining all the overridden values of the use part, which is this and this, right, being combined and given to you. I would say it gives you the access to the runtime use options values, and if you want, you can change it here and set them accordingly also, right? Similarly, this also, right? So these are also like okay, these are not runtime, but this will give you the access to them. Yeah, this is how it is.
Understood.
Okay, great. Let's go back. Now let's try to deep dive into each one of them one by one, right? Let me open this file now. Okay, playwright config.ts. Check out panels B. Right. So let us try to create. Okay, I'll create one more file. Okay, let's just keep it as is. If we'll have a problem. No worries. Let me just remove all this. I don't want any clutter here. Say playwright, 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 and new config.ts. Okay, but then I'll have to change the name of the file. Okay, let's not do that. We have not learned that. Let's not do this. Let's keep this only. Yeah. Okay. The first thing, right? If you see this part, you see these things here over here. These are coming from a general section. Okay. These all because these are not placed under the use section. These are not placed under the project section. So this is your use section, right? This is your use section. There's a project section, and there is after this, right? You can also have an expect section, which we currently don't have. Let's remove this one. Okay, use section and the project section, and you can also have a expect section after this, which is this part. Okay, which we don't want to have. Okay, so this is use, this is project, this is expect, and this is your general section. Now, what all properties can you set in the general section? How would you know? As I told you, what you should do is, this is your docs part. You will go to playwright test configuration, right? Here it tells you about all the configurations, right, which you can set. Basic configuration, right? So there are all the things I mentioned here, right? What all you can use, but there are so see, Playwright supports, right? I think it supports API testing and web automation, right? It also supports visual testing, right? Our area of scope is web automation, right? So we'll talk about the parameters meant for only that, right? So you can look at the list if you wanted to, but I have identified the parameters which are meant for our purpose. So let's try to write it down. Okay, come on. Yeah, here. So the basic section, right? The basic configuration or the general configuration, whatever that is. So here, what you can have is the first parameter which you can have inside is the test directory. Here, you will give the path of the directory which contains your test cases. If you look currently, We have two directories, test and test example, right? But what is given? Dot test. It is saying the current directory slash test folder. So this file is placed in the root of it. So it says current directory, which becomes your FS Playwright. And then within from there, you're saying slash test, which is this folder. And whatever you have within it, right, becomes your scope of execution. Okay, this becomes your scope of execution. Now, this is one part. Okay, this is one part. So test directory. The second thing which we have already seen is the fully parallel. If you remember, right, fully parallel means you can set value to true or false, right? By default, it is false. You can change it to true, and what it will do is, see, Playwright runs test files in parallel, right? This is test file 1, this is test file 1, this is test file 2, and these two files, let's say, have test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, test case 4, right? If you run them with the setting as false, what will happen is Playwright will start one worker for this and one worker for the entire file, and this worker will run these two test cases in series, test case 1 and then test case 2. Similarly, this, if you would have set this to true, what will happen is Playwright would have started 4 worker threads, right? And it would have given worker 1, test case 1, worker 2, test case 2, worker 3, test case 3, and worker 4, test case 4. So it is fully parallel, right? You can see everything is running parallelly. That's why its name is fully parallel. So it's a very important parameter. But you have to be mindful that that your system should be, that you have designed your test cases that they can run in parallel. Okay. And second of all, you should have the underlying infra so strong that that you can take the most use of this, right? Generally, no one is able to use fully this parameter because you are blocked. You have a bottom line, right, on or the upper line on the underlying infra. It's not that everyone has 1,000 CPUs, right, with them to run things. Okay, so yeah, so that is how it will be. Okay, so what is the other parameter? The other parameter is the workers. You can define, you can see by default it is undefined. Okay, it is undefined. What does undefined means? It will be controlled through the through by the different configuration. What are those? Which is your project, how many projects you have, how many uh, worker test files you have. It is defined based on it, right? And it is also, so let's say you have 3 projects and you have 4 test cases, right? Okay, 4 test files. So in a way you want 12 worker nodes. But will those 12 worker nodes run in parallel? No, they can run at max, right? At max, how many worker nodes can run at once, right? I mean in parallel. This is what it defines. It is all based on the underlying infra. Mine system has a 8-core processor, right? So even if I define 12 worker nodes, right, it will be able to run only 8 of them in parallel. It cannot have those things, right? The 12 running parallelly. Let us read about it. If I'm making sense here, just a second. Workers part, where is that? So fully part, right? So we have covered these two. The workers opt out of parallel test on CI. Okay, workers, right? So you can see by default it is undefined. Okay, by default it is undefined. If you want to set them, right, let's say you want to run all your test cases in series, right? So what you should do is remove this and set this to 1. Set this to 1, right? So Playwright will only start one worker. Okay, only start one worker, and you can set your project and test files as 3 and 4, right? Whatever those are. And as per that expectation, the workers should be 12. But since you have defined this to be 1 here, right? This will never be taken care of. This will never be used. Only one worker will be started every time, and that will be having the responsibility to run things in series, right? So everything now will run in series. So first of all, it will pick up test file 1. It will take test case 1 from this. Then it will run test case 2. Once it is done with it, it will then move to test file 2 and then run test case 3 and then test case 4. Okay, this is how you control, you limit the number of workers which can be started, right, by Playwright. The fourth part, where is it? The fourth parameter is the reporter. You can define which reporting you want to use. There are multiple options. We are going to use the HTML report. Okay, the by default report, which is HTML, which is okay for us to use as of now. We'll talk about Allure in the end of our discussion of Playwright. But as of now, we are using, you can see, right, built-in reports. There are so many reports: list report, line report, dot reporter, HTML, blob, JSON, unit. We are talking about HTML1, right? HTML1. And that is what we will set there, okay, in the define config. And that is what we have done. See here, reporter to use, okay, HTML. These are all built-in reporters given by Playwright, right? The fifth parameter. Let's say under your test directory, you said test here, right? Test here. So let's say under this directory, test folder, currently you have 5 files: file1, file2, file3. Let's say 3 files, right? Let's say you wanted to run all three, then this is sufficient for you to have. Okay, you just define the directory and it will know where, from where to pick your test cases. Okay, great. But let's say you wanted not to run all three, you wanted to run maybe a specific one. So there are parameters for it. You can set a parameter called test match. Okay, and then you can give the name of your file which you really wanted to run. Let's say I want to run on test on this f2, right? So you will give the entire path of it, test f2, and then this will run. Or let's say there is a pattern, right? Let's say there are files with f1, f2, f3, and let's say s1, s2, and s3. Okay, let's say. So let's say you wanted to run only the files with f name in it, right? So what you can do is you can asterisk, you can use some regular expressions, and then you can provide the values. So now what it'll do is, out of the entire block of test cases, it will only pick up the ones which matches to this pattern, and only those would be picked up for the execution, right? Similarly, test ignore. There's a parameter called test ignore. You can set up this parameter, right, which will do what? It will, you can set again the regular expression or specific file name. Out of all the test cases, it will ignore the ones which you have mentioned under here. So those will not be executed, right? There's another parameter called output directory. Now, output directory is a parameter which you can set, right? Which where you will define the path of a directory where the output artifact of the Playwright execution should be stored. Like what? If you remember, if you run things right in Playwright, you generate this kind of a Playwright report, right? This Playwright report, and there are like other folders which can be generated as an output of the execution. So all those folders, right, by default are stored in the root directory. But let's say you want to change it. So you have a specific folder under which you wanted to save all this. So that property can be set from this value, output directory. Okay, output directory. What else we have? We have, yeah, we have timeout. Now there are a lot of timeouts which we will have a separate session on timeouts. But the one which I'm writing right now, right, in the general section, timeout here, it means the time which a specific test case should take to complete itself. Okay, and by default the value of this is 30 seconds. So if you have two test cases in this test file, right, and let's say this test case is running, so this test case, right, by default value is 30 seconds. So what will happen is this test case has to complete within 30 seconds. If it does not complete, right, Playwright will throw an error that it has exceeded 30 seconds, and it will just mark it as fail or whatever it will do, right? But it will not allow it to breach after this. If you think your test cases are not will take longer, then you have the responsibility to go and change this value to some other time, like maybe 60 seconds. Okay, so this is the timeout for it. This is for test case completion time per test case, right? Per test case completion time. Okay, so this is the parameters. There are two more parameters which you should be knowing at least. One is called global setup and global teardown. Okay, see, I'm not showing you all the things working in the file right now, because we will have a separate session on the hooks. So I will cover it, some things over there, right? Timeout session, I have a separate session just for timeouts. I will have that session when I will talk about test part, right? Tomorrow I'll talk about this test directory and test match and test ignore. I will show you the implementation of it. But today I want you to realize like where those configurations are going. Okay, from where you will control it. So test, now coming to global setup and global teardown. As the name says, global setup. So this is something, right, which you can provide. You can provide a file name here. which will contain the code which should be executed once, only once per entire Playwright execution, right? So this will run only once, and that too in the beginning, right? And that too in the beginning before starting anything. So this is the file which will be running at first. Maybe you would use it to create some of your test infra. Okay, let's say you wanted to spin up your web application to start this up, right? Maybe you can use global setup for it. Similarly, once you are done with everything in Playwright, all your projects have run, all your test cases have run, and now you wanted to close down your execution, and you wanted to gracefully tear down things, right? There are environments which you want to clean and all that, right? So all of that thing, right, can come here in the global teardown, and this will also run only once, right? Now, these are the parameters which you should be knowing for the web part, coming from the basic parts, and all of this are mentioned here. Where is it? Test configuration, right? If you want to read about it, you can read it here also, but that's the same thing. And if you can right, note that test runner options are top level. Okay, so you can understand, right? All these are like test runner options only, but these are top level options, the global level. You can see workers, you are user. Okay, user. Okay, you will talk about it. Okay, so test configuration means this entire configuration, right? This entire defined config. Okay, so when I say this, so the test configuration, right, is the entire thing, right? So inside this you have this basic one, then you can have a use section, the project section, and the expect section, right? And all these in totality is called as the test runner options, test runner configuration, sorry. Okay, so these are the basic ones which I just explained you. Where is it? So if you see, right, all these are mentioned here. Filtering test cases, right? The filtering one which is a test ignore and test match, so these are here. So you can define your patterns, and accordingly test will be skipped or be part of your execution. Advanced Playwright, right? Output directory folder for test artifacts such as screenshots, videos, traces, etc., right? You can just define a folder which will control all this. Global setup, global teardown, right? You can just define the file which will do all the things for you, right? And this will be running once. What we have more? Expect options. This we have not covered, but these are something for the session library. Okay, so all of these settings can be applied here, right? This is the basic part. Now coming to the use section. Okay, now see, whatever I have defined here, right? Whatever I have defined here, or what I will define here in the use section, can also be used in the project section. Not as if you might not see all the values being available there, but there would be some of them which would be applied in the project part, right? And similarly for the use, although I feel the use is something which is I mean exactly available in the project part. Okay, we'll see that part again, but let's see now. Okay, let's work on the use part as of now. So we're talking about this use section now. If you wanted to know about the use options, this is the one, test use options. Okay, so here, in addition to configuring the test runner which we said, right, you can also configure emulation, network, and recording for the browser in the browser context. These options are passed to the use object in the Playwright config. Okay, so in a way, you can understand that this use, right, whatever you define under the use, right, are something which is meant for browser or the browser context, right? So those properties are going to be used by these two. Okay, whatever you are defining here, right? Whatever you define here are something which is meant for these two. Okay, so if you want to change some behavior under these two, this is the section to use. Just a second. Okay, now what else? Yeah, use section, right? Let's go to the use section now. So test use options, right? And let me show you, this is test use options. This is under doc section. I told you, if you go to the specific software, the API part, test options, right? This is what that use section is about, right? So this is your, here they have given the documentation if you wanted to access it, if you wanted to set a parameter in the configuration file, but if you wanted to access it through the code, right, in the test, you can use it through this object called test options. Okay, so whatever you see here, right, would be exactly same what you see over here in the test use options. Okay, Just two different namings of it, but you have to understand the context. Okay, test use options. If you see this, right, in the base URL, right, this is the first property which you can set, base URL. Let me clean some space to define them. Delete. So we are talking about use section, and I'm again repeating, this use section can be like a global thing, and this the same exact value can be applied within the project section. Okay, under the use part of it. Okay, so use here, and these whatever you define here, right, are what can you define here? You can define the properties which could be meant for browser or browser context to be consumed, right? Let's say, like for example, right, base URL. Base URL is the URL which you will give, right, which this browser, right, will have access to. And in your code, right, if you go and say page dot go to, right, and you just say this slash, right, what it will do is it will take this base URL. Let's say the base URL is https podtest.in, right? I have defined the base URL. If you say this thing, right, it will go and just put a slash to it and open this URL for you, right? So again, similar to the concept which you have seen in WebDriver also. So base URL, and you can see, right, this is meant for browser and browser context. It has nothing to do with the test runner. It is meant for these two things, right? The browser on which you're working. Okay, base URL. What about after this? Test use options, right? Storage state, ignore it as of now. Emulation options, nothing for our purpose. We are not going to emulate anything. But you can see there is a property called viewport, which could be handy for us. Here you can define the size of your browser, right, to open up, the width of it and the height of it. So let me use this one at least. So you have a viewport part. You can define the viewport of the browser again, right, of the browser. So again, properties meant for these two things. So you can define the width and the height of it. Great. If you go down, if you wanted to play with the network, right, let's say accept downloads, right, this is something you might use it, whether to automatically download all the attachments or not. Sometimes the browser does not allow, right, to download the attachments. If you wanted to allow it, you can use accept downloads. Other things you can ignore as of now. From here, recording options, right, recording options. Let's say here, right, using these two or three options, screenshot, trace, and video, right? When do you want to take a screenshot? When do you want to have a trace view? When do you want to have a video being recorded? So if you wanted, so you can define it, right? Screenshot, trace, and video. So let me write it here. This will be very good. So you can define screenshots, video, and trace, right? And what all values can you set? It's not that you can define your own values. No, there are preset values out of which you have to use. So if you see this screenshot, right, the documentation would be here. Capture screenshot of a test option includes off, on, or only on failure, right? So if you want to take a screenshot every time, right, you should take on, right? If you want to grab these screenshots only on the test case failures, you should set this property, right? Trace. Playwright can produce test results. This is like I mean, we have seen this, right? But we'll have a separate session for it again. But you can see the values are off, on, retain on failure, on first retry. This is on the retry mechanism. This is like if it fails, if it only fails, then if you just want to switch it off, just set it to off. If you want to have a trace for every test case, just set it to on. Video, right? Again, you have other options like similar options, right? Off, on, retain on failure, on first retry, right? So this is how things are, right? So you can set from these values, right? Off, on, only on failure, and retain on failure, and all that, right? So these are things which you can set. What else can you set? Action timeout, browser name. You see here, browser name, channel, headless, right? Let's write it. These are important ones. So these are trace thing, browser name. Let me write browser name, channel, headless. What else? We have action timeout. Again, a new action, right? A new timeout, right? A new timeout. One of the timeout we saw in the general configuration, right, of the test under configuration file. That one was for a timeout for the entire test case. Like it was like uh, the maximum execution time the test case can take. If it surpasses that, it will Playwright will throw an error, right? Now, what is action timeout? Now, what is action, right? Actions here, right, means that any activity which you do with an element, if you are finding it, if you're clicking on it, if you're doing anything with the element, right, on the browser, by default the timeout set, right, for those operations is 0, because there is a auto waiting mechanism applied in Playwright also. So it uses its own auto waiting mechanism to find things. But let's say, right, you wanted some extra time, right? So what you can do is you can set it through the action timeout. But generally you will not change it. This will remain 0 only, right? So, but again, they have given you a way to set it up, right? This is 0 for sure. Headless. If you wanted to run your browser in headless or a headed mode, you can set it to true or false, right? If you set it to true, the browser will not open up, everything will happen in the background. If you want it to run in a headed mode, just set it to true. Okay. Browser name and channel, right? Browser name and channel. Why these options are given here? These are given because understand that in your configuration file, right, I told you, in your defined config file, what you can have, you can have you can have this part, you can have this part, and if you wish, like, you can just ignore this part, right? You can just ignore this part. So if you just have these two things, right, you need to tell on which browser you are expecting to run things. So where that information will go? Under this part, use part, right? Browser name. And if you set browser name to Chromium, just for Chromium, right? Chromium has two options, right? MS Edge and the Chrome, right, to be used. Or otherwise, it can use its own default browser, which is given by the Playwright. If you wanted to specifically say that, okay, use Chrome, right? So you will have to set it through channel over here. We have talked about the channel and the browser name, right? When we were talking about the use part, the project section, right? We discussed about it. But these are the things, right, through which the things will be controlled, right? What is happening here is you can define. So in the browser name, you can set three values only: Chromium, Firefox, or WebKit, because these are the three things which Playwright supports. Now, what, let's say you chose Chromium. Now within Chromium, you have options, right? If you do not specify channel, what will happen is it will use the version of the browser which Chromium has, which Playwright was maintaining, right, of the Chromium. So the things will really run on Chromium only. But let's say you do not want it to run on Chromium and you want it to run on Chrome. So what you can do is just come here, set this parameter to Chrome, and now it is using a Chromium browser. But within that Chromium browser, the family of the Chromium browser, it is going to use Chrome, which you have the responsibility of maintaining the binary for it. Okay. Or you can use MSH, right? Channel property will not be applicable for Firefox and it will not be applicable for WebKit. It is only meant for Chromium. Okay. So browser name, channel, headless, action timeout, right? Okay. One more thing. Let's say you have set these values here, right, in the use part of the config file, on the config file. And tomorrow you will do what? After the use section, you also create a project. Now you know that in the project also you have a use section and you can define your browsers here, right? So what will happen here? If you set your browser here to WebKit, what will happen is the global value of the browser name was Chromium, but you overrided that value when it came to the project, right? So what value will be taking effect of? This value, the browser name, which is WebKit, not the Chromium one. I hope you understand the context, right? Okay. So what else? Action timeout I told you, and these are the things. Great. Let's move down. Ignore it. User viewport again, right? Viewport, I think viewport. Okay, viewport we discussed. It can be set where? It can be set here, right? We have seen this. So viewport we have already covered. What else? Configuration scopes. You can see, right? They're telling you about the projects now. Okay, fine. So yes, those are the values, right? Those are the values which you need to be aware of in the use section: base URL, viewport, screenshots, and all this, right? If you want to have the entire options thing, right, these are the properties which you can set. Okay, these are the entire properties which you can set. And if you want to read about it, you can just go and check here, right? Accept downloads. You can set them to false. If you want to set up action timeout, base URL, right? So you can read about all this from here, right? So all these properties can be set here, right? In this part, they are just giving you a handful of items being mentioned here. But if you want the entire list, this is the one which is there, right? So again, viewport is of useful for you, right? Okay, what is video? Again, you can define your video in the use part again here also. User agent, trace, right? Screenshot, locale. You can set headless mode, right? You can set all these things, right? You can do it. But the important ones which I told you, right, are the ones which we discussed, right? Except downloads and all. Okay, so this is what we talked about use section, right? So we are done with the above section, the basic configuration, the use section. Let's go directly to the project section now. Okay, the project part. If you go to the project part, over here, go to this projects. Okay, projects. Again, we know it's a logical group of tests running with the same configuration, right? Let us see how it looks like. So configure projects for multiple browsers, right? It's just a use case, right? So you can use projects like by configuring it for the different browsers. So this will help you to do cross browser testing. This is for cross browser testing, right? You can define, you can take the approach of defining multiple projects for your cross browser testing approach, right? Or the same project can be used to maybe to help you with your scope defined testing. Like what? Like smoke testing and regression testing. You can create a project where you will define only the test cases meant for the regression and the other one for the smoke, and similarly and so on, right? What we have is run projects. Can I show you here? If you see this, right? Although, okay, you see the projects have the use section, right? Use section, right? And whatever you could define in the use section in the above part, you can define them here also in the use part, right? So let me just go back again. Let us clean. Let me write here. We're talking about project section now. Now project section, right? This is an array, and there could be one project, and there could be multiple projects. Let's take one project, right? So for every project, right, make sure you provide a name. So there is an attribute called name, and you should define any name which you feel like. Let's say smoke, right? Let's say Chrome, let's say Firefox, whatever you think it's a meaningful name. You can define it here, name part. And what all parameters you can set? First of all, you can set all the parameters, right? What you could do in the use section, like this. So everything which you could define here can come here also. Okay. And now what will happen is it will be scoped to this project, right? It will be scoped to this project. Let's say there is another project which you're using and you do not define use there, right? So use section is not there. So which use section would be used? The one which you defined above. Not because you don't have it in the project scope here in this part. Let's say this is for regression, right? So which one will be used? This one will be used. In this case, you have defined your own use section. So whatever parameters you define, right? And if they were used in the above part, they would be overridden here. And the other ones would be used as is. Okay, this is how it works. So use section, I don't want to repeat it again, but this is the same thing, right? The same properties can be set. What else can you set? What else can you set? Is it saying here? Okay, there is something called dependencies. Let me just write it here. There's something called dependencies. And there is something called tear down also. Dependencies and tear down. We'll talk about it. Okay, and tear down, running sequence and all, which is fine. I wanted to show you the test project, right? This one. You see all these parameters? Dependencies, expect, right? It's configuration for the expect, right? If you see this expect part is same as what I was telling in the global configuration, right? That you have this expect part here, right? In the global part. So if you wanted to override that value also, right, you can just set it in the project section. Okay, so let's see what does this project part has within it. It has fully parallel. That is something what was in the global scope. So yes, it has it there. Output directory, yes, it has it there, right? Test directory, yes, it has it there. Test ignore, yes, it has it there. test match, right? Timeout, use, test directory, tear down, right? And if you see, it should not have that global tear down and global setup. That is only meant for the global configuration. So those are not applicable here. But if you wanted to have a separate tear down, right, just for this project, you can set it here. Okay. So again, right, so these are the same things which I just told you in the global configuration. If you want them to be in the specific project, you can do it here. Now, two important things which I want to pinpoint here is dependencies and the tear down. Okay, dependencies and the tear down. Okay, now what does it mean? What does it mean? Let's say, right, let's say that you have three projects. Let me clean this up. Delete. So today's session is more about the concepts again, right? We need to get this very straightforward, right? So that we know the mapping of things. Once we have this right, we will be delving tomorrow into the exercise of it to make sure that we understand everything. Okay, there is one more thing which we have to do. We have to understand test runner that methods also, but we'll do it tomorrow. What I'm telling you right now is, let's say, right, in your config file, you have defined things, and here you have project section, right? Project section. Under the project, it's an array of things, right? So let's say this is a project for smoke, and let's say it is running only two test cases. Okay, two test cases. There is a project for regression, let's say, right? Regression, and it has, let's say, 100 test cases being running. There is another thing which is for Chrome, right? Chrome browser. Let's say Chrome regression you have written, right? Let's say Chrome execution, let's say, right? And it will run, let's say, 50 test cases for you. Okay, this is project 1, this is project 2, this is project 3, right? Now let's say, right, we think that whether you start regression, whether you start this, or maybe hundreds of different projects, what you want is, let's say you have defined a project only to do the setup of things. What do I mean? Let me take an example. Let's say there is an application, right? Let's say there is an application which our project has, and right now, before it being used by anyone, right, you need to have some metadata. You need to have some metadata available in your application, right? So that if some users comes to your application, they should be able to, let's say, see some products, right? So that currently, when you got the application, it's a blank slate, right? Let's say, right? I'm just giving a real time thing. So it's a blank slate, and you wanted some data to exist there, right? So what will happen is, here is, right, all these projects, let's say, right, these two projects are expecting the data to be there, and it is not there. Now you have multiple ways to achieve it. One of the ways which Playwright says is, what you can do is, you can just define a project only to create your setup. Okay, to create a setup. So what you can do is, I will create one more project called setup, any name which I feel like, right? And here what I will do is, I will create some test cases in at my end on the Playwright side. Okay, let's say those test cases are test case 4 and test case 5, which will take care of generating the data in the UI. Okay, and those are defined here. What I can do is, so what I need is, if I wanted to run this project, right, Chrome regression, so before running this, right, this needs to be executed, right? So what I can do is, in this project, go and define a property called dependencies, and give the name of this project which is doing the setup. So just go and set up this like this, right? The name of the project. Now what you will do is, now you have these 4 projects defined, and you have created this as a dependency here, right, under P3. Now what you will do is, you will go and run npx playwright test, and say run only the project called P3. Once you do this, right, it will go and try to trigger it, but as soon as it reads about it, gets to know, okay, this is a dependency which I need to run, which is setup. So what will happen here is, first of all, setup will run. So this will get executed, all the test cases will get executed, and only then your Chrome regression will run. Okay, this is how it will run. This is what the meaning of dependencies. You create dependencies for the projects, right, which are projects in themselves. Similarly, for the tear down, you wanted to clean this data now, right? So you will create a new project called P5 tear down. Tear down, let's say tier, whatever name you want to give, right? And let's say there's a test case which you have written which will only clean up the data. So you can create it, and what will happen is you can just define here, right? Clean, let's say whatever that method name is, that project name is. And now what will happen is it will run the setup part, run your entire thing, and when it is done, right, it will run the tear down also, which is your clean part, right? So this is the sequence of things which will run for this part, right? And this is something which you can define at the project level. Okay. Apart from it, the basic configurations are same. The use properties which you could define in the above part is also same. So there is no difference. And devices, right, is like a shortcut given to you by Playwright team, right? They have already created an array of devices with different configurations, right? And if you're interested, just you can do what? You can use the one which matches to your need, so that you can save some trouble from your plate, right? Because Playwright has already done that configuration for those devices. So you can use them from there instead of you defining them again and again. Okay, which we have discussed about devices in the earlier class, right? So tear down, you can see, right? Tear down, this is how the tear down works. Okay, clean up and all that, setup, clean down, and the projects which you wanted to run. Okay, so project we are done. We are done with that part. Okay, one last thing for today, right? One last thing for today. There are 5 different terms. Okay, the test part, right? I told you about there are 3 levels. One is the global level we talked about, project level we talked about. What about the test level? We have not seen where are we defining test things over there, right? Now, where will you define testing? Test things will not go under this file. No, they will not go under this file. They will go where? Under your test case. This part. Let's say this is my test case, right? What you can do is test config. How can I access it? I will have to import it, I believe. Playwright test project, Playwright test config. Let's see. How can I access it? How can I access test project? Find config. Okay, they okay. Uh, test config projects, right? Okay, encapsulates configuration specific to a projects are configured in test config project specified in the configuration file. Not at all properties. Okay, you will not access it from here directly. You will access it through test options, I believe. Just a second. Test.use here, right? You can define it like this. The use part, right, which I told you at the global level and project level, if you want to define it, right, what you can do is you can just use it like this. You will say test.use. Okay, and here, right, if you want to define, you can define the parameters one by one, whatever you feel like. Let's say you want to define a viewport only for this test case, just go and change it here like this. Okay, now this would be applied to all the test cases being mentioned in this file, and they can run. Similarly, there are other parameters for the use part, right? It is very easy. You can do all of this. Now, what are the other things? Right, you can see accept downloads. It says accept downloads. So this same property, you can, let's say you want to set it to, you want that to be, right, set for this value. So you can set it like this, accept downloads. So this same property you could define in the global level, at the project level. Now you can do it at the test level also, like this. And you can keep on setting it. This is the use part. I'm just checking how, is there a way for me to set those project level, or I think, okay, I think I cannot. I think I can. Just a second. Where is the test options? There should be a way here. We are under test options, right? Test options. Do I have a way to access project here? Okay, we don't have a way. So this will only have the properties of it. Test configs. Okay. I will see, right? Can we really access it from here or not? I think I could. Okay, okay, I got it. It has to come from here. Okay, it has to come from here. There is one more thing, right? See, if you wanted to, if you want to set the values, right, of the use part, right? I told you how to do it, right? Through test.use. You can set the properties through test.use from here, right? If you wanted to access the properties set at the global scope or at the project level, right? Right. If you want to access it, for that there is a separate object which is called as test info. Test info, right? So you will use that to access things. And what is there? The documentation is here, right? You can see test info. Test info contains information about currently running test, right? And if you want the access to it, right, you can just say test info. And what all can you access it? You can access all these things. You can access the configuration through config, right? So you will say test info dot config, and you can print all the configurations which have been applied to this test case, right? If you wanted to access the project, right, which has been applied to it, for that I believe, okay, for that again I think it will come from config only, right? So you can go and use this config. Okay, I think this is the process configuration, right? Okay. Okay, let me just tell you this one thing. Okay, see, all of this exercise we'll do tomorrow, but I wanted to clear that picture, right? And that will take just 5 minutes more. See, use part we know, right? How to you how you will be using test use. What I'm telling you now is, if you see the other thing, right, which is this part, this basic configuration, this basic configuration plus anything which you define in the project level, right? So now when these gets applied, and let's say now the test case one needs to be executed, right? What can you do is, so at the runtime, right? At the runtime, when the test case is actually running, right, it will do what? It will create the final config for it to run. Okay, it will look at the global config, it will look at the project config, and then override the required values and come up with the final list of configuration. Okay, now what will happen here is, you can access that final list of configuration through this part. You will say test info dot config, right? If you print it, you can print it out, or if you want to check the value, right, you can do it through this. Okay, and you can do a dot, and you will access all the properties which are defined on the config level, right? And then those will become available, right? Okay, this is the last part. See, again, I said, right, we'll do it everything tomorrow, but now let me just draw the entire map, right, just to make things clear. The entire map what we discussed. See here, we have a conf file, conf.ts. Under this, right, we have basic section, we have use section, and we have the project section, right? Project section, which is an array. This is one project, and this could be second project. Now what happens by default is, these two are available here, these two are available here, right? These two are available here. If you wanted to override them, right, you can, by setting the properties here, right? You can use your separate use section, and you can set the values, or you can set the values of basic in your things, right? You can do that, right? Even the expect part, right, which you have here, right, you can also set it here. Okay, so this is also available here. By default they are available. If you want to change it, you can change it here. Okay, this is the configuration. Now this is your global thing, this is your project level thing, right? So this is your project, p1 project or p2 project, right? Now you have a test file also, test.spec.ts. If you wanted to change the parameters, right, if you wanted to change or see the values which are being currently used of this use section, right, the final version of the use section. So again, you see, right, let's say here, right, there is a use section which is the global one, this is the project level, and somehow it is running test case one, which is this one, right? Let's say test case one, this file on which this will be applied. What will happen here is, at the runtime, when things are now at the runtime, right, it needs a final list, if you need the access to the final list of use. Okay, the final list of use. So let's say some are defined here, some are defined here, and they are overridden, and you want to access or you want to change some properties on it. What can you do is, you will go here and say test.use, and you can define what all parameters you want to change over here in the use. But this is only meant for this use or this use, right? Which is again the same part. But here you are given a choice to set the value at the test case level. Okay, this is the global level, this is the project level, this is the test case level. You can set it here. Now, what about these configurations defined here and here? The other apart from use, you can access them through a object called. But again, like let's say, so you applied some global settings, you applied some project settings, and in the end, at the runtime, there would be a final version of things. Those final version, right? The final version of the config file, final version of the config file, which will be applied at the runtime. You can access it through an object called testinfo.config, and it will give you the access to the things defined under the config file, right? From here. And if you want it, you can access it from there. And every test, right? Every test which you create, right, can have access to test info. They are injected, right? You can inject this test info over here. As soon as you do this, right, this test info will have all the configuration information about this test case available in the config part here, and you can access it. We'll see it tomorrow, right? But this is the whole picture: global level, project level, and test level. Okay, let me write 5 or 6 different terminologies which you should be knowing about, right? There is something called test config. There is something called test project. There is something called test info. There is something called test options. Okay, test options. Let's understand. Let's just understand the context of it. Test config is referring to what? It is referring to your global thing, right? Your global settings. Okay, this settings on the top. Test project refers to the settings which you set at the project level, which is this, the project level. So all the properties which you can set here, you can access it from here. Test options. Test options is your use section, right? Your use section. Whatever you can define in the use section is defined under test options. Test info, right, is the final version. I mean, it gives you the final version or the information about the currently running test, right, at the runtime. Okay, so these are the 4 different things which you know, which you should know. Okay, okay, and there is 2 more terminologies called full config, and full project. So these 2 things over here, right? These 2 things over here are referring to your compile time values, which you defined here, right? These 2 and these 2. If you wanted to access the things which are defined at the runtime for these 2 also, right? You should use this full project and full config and full project. Okay, why I'm telling you this differentiation of the terminology? Because the way the documentation is on the Playwright, if you see under test on the right, you have full config, full project, test config, test info, test options, test project. You will not be if you start understanding yourself, you might get confused, like what are these for? This might look like these are totally different things. No, these are related, and that's why I'm telling you about these terminologies here, right? These terminologies here. Test config is for global, test project is for project section, test option is for the use section, test info is the final information, right, which you can get for a currently running test case, right? And if you wanted to access the final version of the config, right, you will have it from config, and you can have it from the project. Okay. Okay, this is what I wanted to cover today, right, for the configuration file. And you can see this is I mean, from the conceptual part, it is it might look too much, but just understand, right? Just try to break out your things into 3 levels: global, project, and test, and things will start making sense. Okay, we'll see the things in action tomorrow, not today. Okay,
Yeah.
bye. Have a
Yeah,
nice day. Bye.
good day.
Bye.
Bye.